Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
In this presidential election year, a number of foreign policy questions are at the front. Peace in the Middle East, peace in Central America, and the U.S. role in Nicaragua, the proposed IMF treaty that Reagan and Gorbachev have put together that will be pending before the United States Senate. We will discuss these and other issues today on Public Affairs Roundtable with Indiana Congressman Dan Burton, a Republican from the 6th District that represents Blackford, Madison, parts of Delaware, Henry, Clinton, parts of Marion, Tipton. We'll discuss these issues with the Congressman who's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. Also with us, John Rouse, executive producer of Public Affairs Roundtable and a member of the political science faculty at Ball State University. Dan, the recent House vote that denied additional Contra aid must have been some disappointment to you.
No, it was very disappointing. As a matter of fact, Congressman Bob Dornan of California and I took a special order and went into the problem at length up until about 1 o'clock in the morning after the vote. The vote was taken probably around 10:30. And we had about an hour and 15-minute special order talking about it. So yes, I was very disappointed. I think that policy, that appeasement kind of policy, that isolationist policy could very well lead us into a military conflict involving American boys that none of us want.
Why did it fail? Why could not the Reagan administration sell this $36 million plan?
Well, I think that it's a combination of things, Larry. The public opinion in this country is against involvement in Central America, and I think that's due in part to the media, the way this issue has been presented, not by local media, but I'm talking about the big three networks. And as a result, the politicians usually have their ear to the ground, and they're not going to vote for something that they think is going to get them in trouble back home. That's number one. Number two, there's a bunch of congressmen up there, not a large number, probably 50, 60 out of the 435, that are very hardcore in their philosophy. They're more left of center, and they think that we should live and let live, even if it's a communist threat to the mainland of North America, regardless of what the consequences may be. And you put all that together, plus the networks didn't allow the president to make his case at the end, which I think would have been effective in changing a few votes, and we end up losing by 8 votes. If we had had 5 votes switch, we would have won. So I was very disappointed.
There's some question about the cohesiveness or the direction of the Reagan policy regarding the Sandinistas, regarding Nicaragua. Do you see that as some clear direction that the Reagan administration has set down for us? Or, as the critics say, was there a problem that we didn't know exactly where the president was leading us?
I think that there probably has been some mishandling by the administration. Certainly the Iran-Contra problem hasn't helped a bit. But the fact is this: the communists have established a strong beachhead in Central America. The Sandinistas, I talked with Bayardo Arce, one of the 9 communist comandantes in Nicaragua at the airport during my last trip down there. And he told me that they wanted to build at least a 600,000-man army, and if he had his way, it would be a 1,000,000-man army. Daniel Ortega has been on the world market trying to buy 3 million rifles, automatic rifles. They only have 3 million people in the country. What's he going to do with 3 million rifles? They received almost $2 billion worth of military equipment from the Soviets, 33,000 tons just last year of very sophisticated weaponry. And they've been exporting the revolution into other countries. Major Miranda, the chief lieutenant to Humberto Ortega, the defense minister down there, and Daniel Ortega's brother, Miranda said that they plan to export that revolution throughout Central America and up into Mexico. He's told specifically about how they've been doing it, and they have not denied what he has said, and yet we continue to backtrack and let them have their way. I was with President Escona in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, in October or November. And he looked me right in the eye, just like we're talking. We were about this close. And he said if the peace process fails, and if the Contras are no longer a viable force to oppose the communist Sandinistas, that he will request up to 50,000 U.S. troops be stationed in his country and $250 million in direct military assistance. Now that's just Honduras. That doesn't include El Salvador, Guatemala, or Costa Rica. Costa Rica only has a police force. They don't even have a military. So I believe if we don't help the only viable opposition to the communists down there, that we may be buying real trouble later on.
A couple of questions to pick up on your last point. This issue is a continuing one. There was some talk about a compromise on humanitarian aid after the defeat. This issue is going to continue for some time to come.
Yeah. This week, I understand the Democrat leadership, Jim Wright, will be presenting to the House his proposal for humanitarian aid. Now, what I believe it will be a package that will provide just food and medical supplies, and it will be administered or dropped off by agencies like the Red Cross. Now, that sounds good on its surface, but those agencies would have to drop these supplies in predetermined locations, and the Contras are not going to come into those locations and get themselves shot up or become captured. What I think it is it's essentially a policy that will lead to providing a road map and signs saying this way to America or this way to Mexico for many of the Contras, and I think a lot of them will flee the country if they feel like they're not going to get support. Those people aren't going to stay down there without some support and just get picked off one by one. We've already seen about 10 to 15% of the Nicaraguan population flee. Many of them are in the United States, and I think that you're going to continue to see that trend if we cut off all aid, and I'm talking about all military assistance down there. The problem that we face is not just a military one. We will get between 10 and 20 million refugees fleeing Central America and Mexico if this revolution spreads throughout that area. We can't afford to take care of those people. We can't afford the housing, the education, the health care, the jobs that they'll take from Americans. For each 1% of unemployment, it costs you and me, the taxpayers, $35 billion. And it's estimated that if we get 10 million refugees fleeing into this country, that it's going to cost us about 5 to 7% in unemployment. Now multiply that out. That's another $200 billion that we have to live with in deficits.
Your Indiana colleague, Lee Hamilton, says that in denying Contra aid, the Congress basically is taking a risk for peace, saying that we'll test Ortega and see how earnest he is about his peace plans, peace proposals for Central America, that this is a test. That with the understanding, I guess, that if in fact the Sandinistas fail this test, that perhaps the United States could get tougher. Should we not be taking that risk now?
Well, I don't mind giving a test or even a makeup test, but how many makeup tests do you give here at Ball State? In 1979, when the communists took over, they promised freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, free elections, all the things that, freedom of the press, all the things that we hold dear in this country. They didn't make good on any of those commitments. And it wasn't until the Contras started having some success in the battlefields of Nicaragua that the communists finally said, let's go to the conference table and negotiate. They promised the same things again, except in addition, they promised to release the 10,000 political prisoners they've amassed over the past 8 years. They haven't made good on these promises again. They're letting Radio Católica broadcast, and La Prensa publish some papers. But the other newspapers and radio stations in that country are still censored, and the repression continues. And the expansion and exportation of revolution continues as well, under the covers. So, everybody says give peace a chance, and it sounds like to me what Lord Chamberlain was saying prior to World War II in 1938 when he flew to Munich and met with Herr Hitler. I mean, appeasement policies will lead us to the same thing that it's led to in the past. And I believe instead of saying let's just give peace a chance, how about let's let freedom have a chance in Central America? Peace and freedom. Peace without freedom isn't peace, it's slavery. That's a Burtonism. Peace without freedom isn't peace, it's slavery. And what they're saying in Nicaragua, let's have peace, but let the people be enslaved, and I think that's wrong.
Dan, I believe you've been in the Congress now for 8 or 10 years.
Seems like it, but not quite that long.
Well, almost that time.
6 years.
Okay, the Republicans obviously are in the minority. And by this time you are a leader among the Republicans. My question is, first of all, the function of a minority party within Congress is to raise agendas for the majority party to act upon. Is Nicaragua your real primary agenda that you want to raise?
I think there's a number of things that we need to address in the Congress, not the least of which is our foreign policy, and Nicaragua in particular. But I think we have severe domestic problems as well. We have to get control of the deficit. Now, I know everybody talks about that every election, but we passed a catch-all spending bill in the waning days of this Congress. It was supposed to be passed through 13 appropriation bills by October the 1st. There we were on December 22nd at 2 in the morning passing a 14-pound 1,100-page bill that nobody had read that contained $600 billion in expenditures, 25 million of which went to Jim Wright's district for an airport that never went through any committee, a lot of pork barrel projects, and we can't continue to run government that way. You can't run your paper that way, you can't run business that way, but we try to run government that way. And so I think we need to address the spending policies of this nation and the economic policies. That should be a number one consideration. Secondly, I think that in foreign policy we need to deal strongly with the communist expansionist movement, which hasn't changed since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. People believe it has. They talk about glasnost and perestroika and everything. But the fact of the matter is the Soviets are still sending $2 billion into Angola in military hardware, $1 billion into Mozambique, $2 billion into Nicaragua. There's Soviet generals leading the attack in Angola. There's Cubans, 40,000 Cubans there at the behest of the Soviet Union. So the expansionism of the Soviet Union is still a threat to the free world. And so there's a number of issues. And since I'm on foreign affairs, obviously I'm more in tune with what's going on in the foreign affairs area. But domestically, we have severe problems as well.
Well, let me take you back to the budget. Obviously, all the 435 Congress people and also the senators, they do not read the entire budget, but they read particular parts of the budget that go to their particular districts. Let me ask you, what programs would you say should not be in the budget for next year?
Well, that budgetary process is even more complex than you've laid out. I mean, there's 13 committees. Right. They're supposed to analyze what's in their committee, and then when the appropriation bill goes to the president, they're supposed to know what's in there. When they send that catch-all spending bill, it's tied up in bundles with big black marks across it, and it's tied up with string. It comes in boxes to us. I'm telling you, there's nobody in that chamber that knows everything that's in there. And it's really a tragedy the way we conduct business. Regarding what I think the major priorities are in the area of spending cuts, I think that we should look at the whole budget as far as spending cuts are concerned. And I'm including the Defense Department. I'm a very strong defense advocate. I think spending is so far out of control that we need to have a unified approach, maybe a very simplified approach to cutting the budget. Because if you cut one area and not another, you get screams from this part, but you don't get screams from over here. When I go to my town meetings, I talk to senior citizens, and they say, it's all right if you cut everybody fairly, but if you just cut us, there's going to be a big problem. And when I talk to people in the area of education, they say, well, don't cut education, but if you cut everybody fairly, then we'll go along with and bite the bullet like everyone else. The same thing's true with highways and defense. So I think that what we need to do is have an approach that looks at the overall budget and finds out what we can realistically cut across the board out of everything. Maybe it would be a freeze. Maybe it would be a 2% cut, but whatever it takes to get this budget under control, we're going to have to do.
But isn't that freeze Graham-Rudman-Hollings? I mean, aren't you saying that in the final analysis, because the various interests cannot agree in Congress, it's going to end up being the cuts that have been mandated through the Graham-Rudman-Hollings?
Yeah, I think Graham-Rudman-Hollings, Mac, there's another sponsor on there, County Mac of Florida, who's running for Senate. I think that is better than no game at all, and I supported it. But the fact of the matter is Graham-Rudman-Hollings, Mac, doesn't cut the entire budget. It leaves about 60% of the budget untouched. Only about 40 to 45% of the budget falls under the provisions of Graham-Rudman-Hollings, Mac. And so what happens is you're loading the cuts, the mandated cuts, onto a smaller and smaller part, or onto a smaller part of the budget than most people realize. And those cuts should be fair and equitable for everybody if you're going to have constituent support around this country. You can't cut one area and leave another untouched without causing all kinds of chaos now. And so I think we need to scrutinize the budget, and if we can get by, and in some areas, if we have to go ahead with some areas that need additional attention and not cut them more as severely as others, maybe we can do that. But the entire budget needs to be scrutinized.
8 years ago, a guy named Ronald Reagan campaigned for president on this platform that he would balance the budget. We haven't had a lot of leadership out of the White House in terms of moving toward that balanced budget. The president obviously has never submitted a balanced budget to Congress, and there's been a lot of spending, whether it's defense spending or whatnot, proposed from the White House. Do we need a real change of direction, a little stronger leadership in terms of budgetary matters in the White House?
All spending, as you know, Larry, originates in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we cannot get away from the responsibility that is ours. When they point the finger at Ronald Reagan and the administration saying, hey, it's your fault that we have these huge deficits, it couldn't be further from the truth. He can't spend one dime without us first appropriating it. Granted, he sent budgets over there that were in excess of what I would like to have seen. But it isn't anything compared to what we spend in the House. We have spent time and again more than what the President has requested. The preponderance of the blame rests with the Congress of the United States for these deficits. The White House isn't blameless, but the major part of the blame rests with the House. We passed a budget about a year ago, and when we passed that budget, it had some constraints in it that I thought were good. The next day, we had 3 bills come before the House that were Democrat-sponsored bills, all in excess of the budget for their part of the budget. I don't know whether it was housing or welfare or what it was, but they were all in excess of what they agreed to the day before as far as the budget was concerned, and they voted overwhelmingly for all 3 of them. So they were 3 budget buster bills that passed the day after the budget. See? So when they try to blame the White House, it just doesn't
But spending isn't really a Democratic and Republican issue. I mean, when you went to Congress, you had a Republican Senate, too, as well as a Republican President. So, I mean, it's not like Republicans, the White House isn't blameless, Republicans aren't blameless. Certainly Democrats in the House have controlled the beginning of the budget process, but Republicans have gone along with it.
Let me tell you how that works, though. You see, if the House passes a budget or a big spending bill, and they send it to the Senate, and the Senate cuts it, and the White House says, hey, we're going to veto that thing if you send it over here this way, and then it goes back to conference committee. When the conferees sit down, the Democrats who control the House Ways and Means Committee, and Dan Rouse Collection is a master at this, he'll look across the table at you and say, well, now you want this for defense? You want this for defense? Then you're going to give me this or you're not going to get it. I'm telling you, they hardball in those meetings. Sure. And so the White House is sitting there with their budget expert, and he's sitting there, he goes back to the President and says, look, if we want to get this for defense, we're going to have to go along with this god-awful garbage proposal that they want, because if we don't, we're not going to get this. And so there's trade-offs made. And as a result, the President has to sign a lot of things into law that he doesn't want in order to get his budget, or get his parts of the budget for himself. Now, the President has asked continually for a line-item veto, and the reason he wants that is because he could then, when that thing comes to his desk, say, this is garbage, and he could cut this stuff out. But he doesn't have that opportunity now, and therein lies the problem.
But the problem is that if you go with the line-item veto, it could also hurt the Republicans, because at some point in time in our history, there may be another Democratic president.
That's right.
Speaking of presidential politics, in 1980 and 1984, the Republican coalitions were 2 things: conservative economics and conservative social issues. Are those 2 concerns, religion and conservative economics, is that going to be the base for the Republican perhaps winning the election in this year?
You know, you'd have to ask each individual voter that question. You know, people are asking me what's going to happen in New Hampshire. I was just up there campaigning for Jack Kemp, and they asked me what's going to happen in South Dakota today in their caucuses out there. I don't think anybody knows what is the hot spot that's going to hit a particular voter or group of voters. I think what you have to do is look at the overall candidate, the overall impression, the overall party platform, and then people start deciding what position they want to support. But I'm sure that all these things you mentioned, moral issues, which are very much in the news right now, financial issues, economic problems, and foreign policy, they're all going to have their part in the elective process, and it just depends on what people are most concerned about at the time the election takes place.
But isn't it kind of, I mean, our system is democratic, and what you've just described in terms of all the complexity is the downside of the democratic process. We blame each other. Each party blames the other party. We all blame each other. So my question is, you're known as a conservative Republican.
Right.
But aren't these terms, in today's complex environment, aren't these terms conservative, liberal, aren't they just about as important as the terms Federalists and Whig are today? In other words, they're having less and less importance, and the whole issue of trying to describe this process and come to grips with it is something that I seem to have trouble with, but also others do too.
Well, I think a lot of people are having trouble discerning what each individual congressman or senator stands for, and it's more of a PR job through constituent contact that gets them elected or reelected. I like to think that my record as one congressman speaks for itself. The ACU's given me a 100% rating. The ADA gave me almost a 0 rating. That tells you that I'm voting pretty much against tax increases and for fiscal responsibility as far as cutting spending is concerned. But a lot of people don't look at those things. And I think that you're probably right. The perception among most voters is that, philosophy really isn't as important as what they're doing back in
But aren't
history.
you really a liberal on defense spending?
No, of course not.
Well, you're asking for more government spending, aren't you?
No, not really. I'm asking for an adequate amount of spending to defend this nation. I don't think it's a liberal to say that we should have the facilities and the ability to defend ourselves against the communist expansionist policy in Central America, for instance, or to provide for a naval task force that can defend our shores against Soviet subs that are now in those waters, or that we should provide for an air force that's going to be able to defend us against some kind of a military conflict in other parts of the world where we have strategic interests, like NATO or Southern Africa or elsewhere. That's not a liberal approach to make sure we have a strong defense. Now, I know the liberals say you're overspending on defense, and that's a matter of conjecture, I suppose. When President Reagan took office, we had fallen hopelessly behind the Soviets as far as military personnel, military capability, hard equipment's concerned, and that had to be made up. And so those of us in Congress that felt like there was a window of vulnerability voted for additional expenditures. But I don't think that makes me a liberal on defense spending. I think it means that I still have a conservative philosophy.
Are you comfortable with the IMF proposal that President Reagan is submitting to the Senate, recognizing the House isn't going to get a vote on it, but certainly have the opportunity to speak out on it?
Yeah. The President and I agree 90% of the time. This is one area with which I disagree strongly with the President of the United States. I think the INF Treaty is a terrible mistake. And the reason I think it's a mistake is because the SS-20s that are going to be destroyed, 1,400 warheads, are not going to be destroyed. The warheads and the guidance systems on the SS-20s can be kept by the Soviets. The only thing that's destroyed is the actual launching rocket itself. In exchange for that, we're going to destroy our Pershing II and ground cruise missiles, which are the only missiles over there that can hit the Soviet Union. It keeps them honest. So we're giving up the Pershing II and ground cruise missiles. They're not giving up anything because they're now building a new generation of weapons called the SS-25, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit the United States, but it can also be retargeted on the same targets that the SS-20s can. So in essence, what we're doing is we're giving up our deterrent force, and they're modernizing theirs. And they already have a tremendous conventional superiority over there. They have about a 2 to 3 to 1 advantage in conventional superiority as far as force strength is concerned, and a 5 to 1 advantage in tanks and other mechanized equipment. So we're giving up a lot, and they're not giving up anything. As a matter of fact, they're improving their position. And I don't see how that lends itself toward world peace.
Why is President Reagan proposing this treaty then?
Well,
is he unaware of all this?
Well, I've tried to talk to him about it, and I've sent letters over to him explaining my position. I think that the zero option proposal that they've been talking about for some time was sold to him. I can't tell you why he's taken the position he has, but I can tell you for a fact that General Bernard Rogers has talked to me personally, and General Bernard Rogers, our last Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, says the same thing I'm telling you right now. He thinks it's a tragic mistake and could lead to a real problem. At the very least, it's going to put NATO in a position where they're going to have to succumb to some kind of military and political blackmail down the road. At least that's my view, and I think we should do it.
Or perhaps put money into the programs. Let me take you back to presidential politics. The Times Mirror Company, which owns the LA Times and the National Journal, has had the Gallup poll do a survey that says that social justice, rather than economic satisfaction, will probably be the most important single issue in 1988. How do you, as a Republican, define social justice for Americans? I mean, what is social justice, if I can say the word, in your opinion?
Oh, well, I think social justice is to take care of those who are truly needy, who are truly in need of help, people who need welfare assistance, who don't have the ability to take care of themselves or their children. Those people, the truly needy, we should take care of. Those who are capable of taking care of themselves but want to be on the dole instead of getting a job, we should ferret those people out and force them to work. If they don't want to find gainful employment but they're physically able, we should say to them, in exchange for your welfare benefits, you're going to do public service work, clean up the highways and other things. And if you don't want to do that, then we're not going to give you welfare benefits. Those able-bodied who don't care to work should be forced to work or not get their benefits. I think that in the area of housing, that we need to make sure that there's adequate housing provided for those who are indigent, who need housing. We can't let them die on the streets. But at the same time, we need to look at the restrictions we're putting on private ownership of property. For instance, in New York, they put rent controls on housing, and so the fellow who owned those dwellings, they couldn't raise the rents above a certain level, and if it was unprofitable, well, the guy said, let's just let the building become a slum, because it's less of a hardship on me as a building owner to let this thing just become a slum and die on the vine than to put more money into improving the property. And as I improve the property, I can't make any profit because there's a ceiling on the rents. And so we have forced many of these areas to become slums because of governmental policy. And so if we're going to provide adequate housing for people, we should take some of these restrictions off so the private sector, the private entrepreneur, can also provide housing at a reasonable rate for people. And the government should try to keep pace with those rents so we can take care of those who really need help. The problem is we've taken a lot of housing out of circulation and let it become destroyed in exchange for building public housing projects, and the cost has been astronomical to the American people. And we can't continue down that road.
Speaking of presidential politics and the dole, you're a Kemp man. Where do you see the Republican
I like that lead-in.
the Republican race for the presidential nomination going? Is it a Bush-Dole race?
Well, it is right now, but I still think Jack Kemp, the man that I'm supporting, has a chance, albeit a long shot. I like his philosophy in foreign policy and domestic issues much better than I do the others. But regardless of who we nominate in the Republican Party, I think that they will be superior to those that are running in the other party, and I know that's a partisan position. But I've listened to the views of the others, and I think protectionist legislation like the trade bill that Gephardt's talked about, or just more throwing money at problems like Simon and the others have talked about, is not the answer.
And if you conservatives have to give up the Robertsons and the Kemps of the campaign, have to choose between Bush and Dole, which way do you go?
I think either one of those would be all right. Philosophically, I'm more in line with Kemp, though.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time today. Thanks to our guest, Congressman Dan Burton from the 6th District of Indiana. Also thanks to John Rouse, our producer. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Mike Seaborg, Bill Mosier, Nancy Carlson, and Steve Johnson. This program is a production of University Media Services and the Department of Political Science. Facilities and funding are provided by University Media Services on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.